So welcome to everyone to today A Cup of Tea Together. So A Cup of Tea Together is organized by TU Dublin Conservatoire in collaboration with the festival called Autunno. And a huge welcome to Fabio Zanon, our guest today. Hi Fabio, and thanks a lot for accepting the invitation. Fabio is really a special musician. Thanks Fabio. And Fabio is really a special musician in the guitar world. He's a performer, author, conductor, teacher, and he also created a series of radio programs dedicated to our repertoire. This one is the first lecture of a series dedicated to the repertoire of Julian Bream and John Williams. We will continue next week with Michael O'Toole and then with Steve Goss, talking about first John Williams and then the collaboration John Williams and Julian Bream with the composers. And also they are here, Michael and Steve, so thanks also to you. Today we will start streaming the lecture that Fabio gave last November in Milano as part of the festival called Autunno. And the festival was dedicated to David Rubio and to Julian Bream. David Rubio is he was a great guitar maker that collaborated with Julian Bream. And during the festival, we had concerts, exhibitions with modern and historical instruments, and a symposium. And Fabio was the keynote speaker. He gave a lecture and a concert with the repertoire written for Julian Bream. Today we will listen only the first part of the lecture.
Okay, I'll try to talk a bit about Julian Bream and his repertoire, as it seems very suitable in a festival that is dedicated to Dave Rubio, who was such a constant collaborator of Julian's. Nowadays, I've been studying a few mental disturbances, and one of them is the people who have some very small knowledge about a subject, and they think they know all about that, and start to talk and give lectures and try to convince people of that. Well, I hope I don't suffer from that. I mean, I've had some contact with the music of Julian Bream, and I saw him playing very, very often, especially during the 90s, but that is as much as I can go. So just going to talk about my experience with the repertoire. On the 14th of October, the literary critic Harold Bloom died in the United States. I don't know if you are familiar with Harold Bloom. He's probably the most influential critic in the last 30 years or so, especially in two books. One of them is called The Western Canon. That is very relevant for us musicians, actually, because he defends very strongly, and to some people in a very conservative way, the masterworks, the works that have created the reverberations and have created references for all the other works of poetry and literature to be judged from. He was a strong advocate, and this book really makes an analysis of all the books that were the dearest to him, starting with Homer and the Bible and Shakespeare, that is central for him, and Dante and Dostoevsky. And there's another one that is actually just an essay called The Anxiety of Influence, L'angoscia dell'influenza, which is very short, and I really recommend everybody to read. I'll talk about that one later. For the time being, I'll just say that there is a musicologist, and actually his specialty is aesthetics in Brazil, called Sidney Molina. And he did his doctoral dissertation about Julian Bream's discography under the light of Harold Bloom's theories. And I'm going to draw a bit on this work. The name of the work is The Guitar in the Disc Era. As I said, he thinks that the literary criticism can be applied to the art of interpretation. So I'm assuming here that interpretation is an independent art in itself that creates its own canon. And it can be read also in terms of who influences who and how the repertoire develops along with the players. If we think of classical music in general, up until the beginning of the 19th century, most musicians play their own music most of the time, frankly. Of course, you had the professional orchestral musician or choral singer, but when we are talking about not only the major composers, but any active composers, they essentially played the music that was closest to them, that was their own. So if you think of Mozart or Bach or Liszt or Chopin, they played essentially Mozart, Bach, Liszt, Chopin, not much besides that. At the end of the 19th century, the separation started to get more pronounced, especially with the advent of a new character in the music world called the maestro, the conductor, who was a specialist in putting people together to play, something that was uncommon until the age of Mendelssohn Berlioz. So when we get to the end of the 19th century, opera, symphonic music, chamber music, piano, they have a crystallized repertoire that was set up by the major virtuosos of the era. If you think of Liszt, for instance, he was a strong advocate of Chopin, Schumann, Beethoven. He was the first guy who really gave concerts where a big chunk of the concert actually was music from the past or music composed by his colleagues. When he became a conductor, he did the same. He premiered many works by Berlioz or by Wagner. So that is the era where the canon is established. If we think of opera, until today, if we think of the 100 operas that are most performed, we are talking from Mozart to Richard Strauss. If we think of piano, we are thinking of Bach to Prokofiev, perhaps. Of course, there are other canonic composers that come after that. Many people would play Messiaen, for instance, but it's not the sort of thing that most people go to the piano concerts to listen to. Chamber music is something that goes from Haydn to perhaps Shostakovich. So we have those 100 best works for each one of those media that were already crystallized by the turn of the 20th century. The guitar didn't. The guitar carried on with the composer, guitarist character for quite a few years. And in the second half of the 19th century, we didn't have the same development. I mean, the guitar didn't follow the changes in society that turned classical music into something historic. If we think of people like, at the turn of the 20th century, Manhon or Broca or even Tárrega, essentially they played their own music, their own arrangements. You don't see Tárrega playing Rossinianas by Giuliani. I'm not even aware whether he knew this music or not. He was essentially playing his own music. So we get to the era of 1910 when commercial recordings really start to pick up, and we still don't have a canon for the guitar. We already have people like Miguel Llobet or Emilio Pujol who are creating a new repertoire, but I mean, Llobet didn't have the time to record all the best pieces of his repertoire. And when we look at his concert programs, essentially is he comes there, plays a few Bach transcriptions, one or two short sword pieces, then it's Llobet, 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 Tárrega, 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 Albéniz, Granados, his own arrangements. Of course, he premiered pieces by Lopes Chavarri and Manuel de Falla and everything, but I mean, that was not the typical format of his concerts. And you can say the same about Agustín Barrios, Regino Sanz de la Masa, and so on and so forth. There is a big turnaround when André Segovia comes to the scenario, because he's already a person who made recordings that travel around the world and were very important to establish an image of what the classical guitar was like. Just, coming from the airport, from the airport to the hotel on the taxi, of course, the driver asked me, "Oh, what kind of guitar do you play? I said, oh, I play classical guitar. And the guy, oh, I know, I play some Eric Clapton. But I know this guy Segovia. Huh? So still today, I mean, people who don't know anything about classical guitar will have one name that still clicks, and that is the old Andres. And that's why Sidney Molina, in his doctoral dissertation, he says that the guitar established its canon not with printed music, and not only with concerts, but also with recordings. We are talking about Segovia's first recording at the end of the 20s. It was Gavotte and Rondeau by Bach. And soon after, he recorded pieces by Moreno Torroba, and a bit later on, the last movement of Castelnuovo Tedesco's Boccherini Sonata, and so on and so forth. This carried on until pretty much the end of the war. I mean, until 1949, he was still doing the 78 vinyl recordings. There were bestsellers around the world. Only in some other places, people like Ojianguren or Laurindo Almeida were extremely popular, but essentially, if you went to Japan or to Soviet Russia at the time, people would know Segovia's recordings. And that is where Julian Bream comes in. He started to play in the 40s, just after the war. His career picked up in the 50s. And he has described oftentimes not only that listening to Segovia's recording of Tárrega's Recuerdos was what made him actually enjoy the sound of the guitar. Not only, you see, not only the music, not only he was in love with Tárrega's piece, but he was also in love with that beautiful effect that Segovia's tone quality produced. And he wanted to do something along those lines. He also said that when he was a teenager, Segovia played in London pretty much every year at the Wigmore Hall. That is a hall about this size. It's about 500 seats. And he would bring his binoculars just to watch his technique, especially his right-hand technique, so he could figure out how to develop tone production, because there was really not qualified teaching for that area of playing at the time. I mean, it was very, very intuitive. Even if you read Pujol's book about tone quality, it's very philosophical, very poetic, but he doesn't really tell you, wow, get your finger, fire your nails, and pull that way. So that was something that he had to discover for himself. Of course, the guitar has kept both paths. The one of the interpreter as a curator of repertoire, that was the role of, say, Segovia, Julian Bream, to a certain extent, John Williams, Narciso Yepes, and the whole generation that is still active today. But we also kept the figure of the composer-guitarist. I mean, Hollandians, Carlo Domeniconi, Marek Pazieczny, and so on and so forth. We still have a very strong area of repertoire that is made by, well, even Leo Brouwer, even though he doesn't play any longer, he was a guitarist in his youth. So, coming back to Segovia, he gave his imprimatur to the repertoire. He becomes suddenly the center of the guitaristic canon. I mean, the works that we play on the guitar still nowadays, and the programs that we have in the conservatory, I mean, what most people play. I've just heard somebody playing Torroba's Piezas Características when I came in. And still, so many people play Manuel Ponce, Tanzmann, Castelnuovo Tedesco, Villa-Lobos, and so on and so forth. So, on the top of that, he also adapted early music, not what he did, in fact. I mean, Segovia didn't go to museums or churches and got tablatures to learn, but he was very, very much acquainted with what people were doing at the time, especially, you know, the new harpsichordists like Wanda Landowska and later on Rafael Pugiana. And he had this knack for listening to a certain piece of music and saying, oh, if I try to do that on the guitar, might have some effect. And thus we got Frescobaldi's Aria con Variazioni, and so many other pieces that are still part of our repertoire today. Of composers that was very obscure then, and are still obscure today, like Kuhnau or Benda. I would love to see more people trying their hand of rearranging these pieces, because they are really very effective on the guitar. Yeah. So early music, transcription, and the new composers. It's very interesting that, with the probable exception of Villa-Lobos, Roussel, maybe Turina, all the composers who wrote for Segovia, they sort of became the canon of the guitar. I mean, of course, Castelnuovo Tedesco is a super great composer, especially his symphonic music is fantastic. But so few people still today know much of his other music because he's so associated with the guitar. We see, let's say, a disc by Narciso Yepes that has Spanish guitar music. Rodrigo, Torroba, Turina, Castelnuovo Tedesco, and Villa-Lobos. I mean, people still think of that as Spanish music, which is bizarre. But that is the way it was back in the 50s and 60s. And of course, when Segovia came to the long playing era, I mean, to have a disc that can play about 20 to 22 minutes each side and you can turn it around, he started to organize his discs as a kind of simulacrum of a concert performance. You can see that he usually played concerts in 3 parts, where he had a very short interval between the first and second, and a longer interval before the last part. He would play probably early music like Milan, Narvaez, Dowland, Haydn, whatever, in the first part. The second part usually was taken by transcriptions, Bach. Later on, he added composers like Ponce or Tasman. And towards the end, he would come back to his favorites and play a bunch of Spanish pieces. Usually, he would end his concerts with Asturias or Torre Bermeja or even Granada sometimes, or Granada's Dance Number 10. So this was the format that he brought to his recordings. I remember very well the first Segovia recording I bought. It was Frescobaldi, Tasman Cavatina, and Torroba Nocturno in the first side A. And then you turn it over, it was Ramon Minuet, Capriccio Diabolico, and 6 Preludes by Ponce, or something like that. So you even remember the order of the pieces sometimes, because the music just comes as a kind of integrated concert to us. That is where the anxiety of influence starts, the theory that Sidney tries to apply to the discography and the whole outlook of Julian Bream's career in relation to Segovia. I cannot really discuss details about musical performance as such, the way, the statics of each one's playing. But of course, to make it a very complex theory, very, very simple, so we can discuss it, the anxiety of influence, Harold Bloom applies that especially to poetry. Usually a person starts to write poetry because this person has read another poet. And of course, when you start to write your own poetry, soon you realize that you cannot really write anything original because your favorite poet has already written what you want to write. So there's this anxiety of influence, this displacement of expectations on the part of the new artist. So this new artist has to go through the kind of Freud-Nietzsche process of negation of the older poet who has influenced his or her writing. First going through a phase of denial, and then to evade the psychological obstacle, the new poet has to be convinced, or to convince him or herself, that there are some shortcomings in the older poet, so they can start to develop his own voice. And at the end, he sort of reincorporates, he brings back the ghost of the older poet in his own poetry, but in a transfigured way, as though the older poet had been influenced by himself. You see that very clearly in classical music. The much of Mozart there is in Beethoven's music that was denied quite at first, and that you start to hear more and more towards the late quartets and the late symphonies. If you think of Beethoven's 8th Symphony, it's pretty much a homage to Haydn, isn't it? So it's very clear that that can be applied to composition, but can that be applied to musical interpretation and to the guitar canon? I think it's, to me at least, very clear right from the start. I mean, if you think of Julian Bream's programs, right from the start, he would do in a kind of chronological way. He would start with some Gaspar Sanz or Baroque music, play a complete Bach suite. I have a few programs here that I will not waste time with that, but that was his typical program, to open up with some Weiss and then play a complete Bach suite and then play one of the major Sohr or Giuliani works, and then he would come in the second half, he would play, say, Dodson's Partita, and then Nocturnal, and then Ponce, Sonatina Meridional, and then everything with Villa-Lobos, especially studies that Segovia didn't like number 11. So there is a denial in the format right from the start. And of course, the interest he had for certain kinds of transcription and certain kinds of commissioning. I'll talk about the commissioning later on. There is another aspect of his playing that we can never overlook. He started his career as a lute player. Actually, I mean, a big-time career. Even his first recording was a recording of English songs with Peter Pears. And the second recording was a disc of Dowland lute pieces. Everybody knows that Segovia didn't have much respect for the lute. He considered that as a dead instrument, and he just thought that everything that could be played on a lute could be played also on a guitar, which we know is not true. But Julian, of course, he commissioned a kind of instrument that was a hybrid between a guitar and a lute, so he could keep his very intense approach to the strings and still play a lot with colors and different levels of different platforms of sound, and thus he created a format that he very often applied during the 60s and 70s, that he would bring two instruments to the concert, play the first half with the lute, and play the second half on the guitar. With that, of course, he renewed the canon enormously. If we are able to play Dowland, William Byrd, Francesco da Milano, Narvaez, Milan, well, frankly, Julian did that before us. And he's pretty much the guy who brought that into the repertoire big time. Again, I don't want to diminish the merit of other guitarists, but we cannot really compare the reach of Julian's recordings, because, I mean, he recorded for a multinational top recording company, which had distribution all over the world, and exactly in the era where people actually bought records. I mean, if he had done that today, he wouldn't have much effect, frankly. But at that time, people were crazy for buying LP records, and he knew how to use that. But what is his approach to recordings and to choosing his concert repertoire? He's not the guitar LP, as Segovia did. He's the work LP. So if you look at his discography, when he starts back in the 1950s, I think his first recording, as I said, was 1955 with tenor Peter Pears. They made this recording of English Renaissance songs. And then he does a few LPs that have a mix of Fernando Sohr, Turina, Villa-Lobos, and everything. And then he does one that is Torroba, side A, Villa-Lobos, 5 preludes, side B. Something that was very unusual in the previous generation. I mean, to record complete works like that. All 5 Villa-Lobos preludes. Segovia recorded only 2, actually. Then, at the early 60s, he recorded a Bach LP, a full Bach LP. Of course, John Williams had done that, I think, in 59 or 60. But then he recorded 2 lute suites. And Segovia suddenly felt a bit compelled to do it himself as well. Only in the mid-60s, Segovia did record the 3rd cello suite for the guitar in John Duarte's arrangement. So you see that there is this mutual dispute in between them. I don't know if it was very clear, but we can tell by the way the industry developed that they were doing that. So that was the first 6 discs of Julian Bream that were pretty conventional in that sense. And then we have a clear denial of what Segovia was doing, and we have in 65 that fantastic recording of 20th century guitar that brings Frank Martin, the first recording of Britten's Nocturnal, the recording of Hans Werner Henze's Three Tentos, and El Polifemo de Oro by Reginald Smith Brindle, and he ends up with Villa-Lobos, which, don't forget, was a contemporary composer at the time. He died in '59. So, yeah, that recording that was something the recording company didn't want to do, became a worldwide success, got all the prizes one can imagine, and opened up space for him to do much more commissioning work. Another thing that is in denial of the inheritance he got from the previous generation is the fact that Julian really played a lot of chamber music. Most of us are familiar with his duets with John Williams, but he also played duets with harpsichord player George Malcolm. They did 2 discs together. He created his own ensemble, the Julian Bream Concert, specialized in English Renaissance music. He made recordings with string quartet, and so on and so forth. I saw him in this kind of setting at least 3 times, including playing Takemitsu's Toward the Sea and a few other works. And of course, then the commissioning work started, and he became a kind of curator of repertoire, and we should be very grateful to him, I think, for all he's done. Again, transcription-wise, he tended to favor major works, apart from Bach, that he really played much more than he recorded. I watched Julian play from '91 until his last concert in 2001. So it was 10 solid years. I watched concerts of his every year, sometimes 3 or 4 a year, in different venues, always playing with the Hauser guitar, at least because I was living in England at the time. And we could see at first that he was playing different suites by Robert de Vizet almost every concert. He was very much in love with Robert de Vizet towards the end of his career. He played Bach, BWV 995. I saw him playing the first cello suite, the third cello suite, the 6th cello suite, a very complicated arrangement that, as far as I can tell, he'd never published. I saw him playing Astor Piazzolla. I saw him playing Tandem Variations. I mean, pieces that many people, I didn't see, but I've got a recording of him playing Barrios La Catedral, actually. Again, another area that was very different from Segovia's repertoire. So, first talking about early music, he also transcribed a suite by Buxtehude, another one by Froberger, composers that were, oh, it's just to tell me that I have to finish. So he went for substantial pieces that were not the staple of the repertoire before. Before finishing, of course, I would like to stress his commitment to the commissioning of new music that stretched until today. I've managed, there is a website that you can search, but I'm going to, it's very, very quick actually. I'll just list the pieces that were commissioned and or written for Julian Bream, of which he had some kind of input. He either revised or published the pieces, he did his editorship, and you see that there's hardly 1 year in his professional career that lasted for 40 years actually, where he didn't premiere some sort of music. So it started in 1945. I mean, we are talking about a guy who's 12 years old, and he played a suite by Terry Usher, who is a very respectable composer actually. In 46, there's a sonata by Terry Usher that is really nice, a piece by John Duarte, and a nocturne by Reginald Smith Brindle. It's a lovely work that really everybody should know the existence of. In the next few years, 48, 2 other pieces by Terry Usher, 1950 the same, 1953, Prelude, Nocturne, and Toccata by Stephen Dodson, a composer that we usually associated to John Williams, who recorded 2 of his guitar concertos, but he composed for Julian first. Malcolm Arnold, Serenade for Strings, was the first piece written for guitar and orchestra in '55 that he premiered with a community orchestra in Richmond. Soon after, Stephen Dodson wrote his first guitar concerto for Julian, and it was recorded by John Williams later on. Then it comes 56, Brindo El Polifemo de Oro. 57, Lennox Berkeley Sonatina. 57 again, Britain, a song cycle. 58, Hans Werner Henze, Drei Tentos. Dennis Ap Ivor, Variations for Guitar, incredible Welsh composer that nobody really talks much about. He also had a guitar concerto that was premiered, I have a recording of that, was premiered by Julian Bream with a BBC orchestra in 1956, if I'm not wrong. So it was probably the first major work that he premiered with orchestra. Then Tristram Carey, Sonata. William Walton, a song cycle. You see, he was very much concerned about song cycles at the time because he was playing a lot with tenor Peter Pearce, who was Benjamin Britten's partner. So, of course, he got many concerts by playing with him and a lot of visibility as well. So, also Michael Tippett, Songs for Achilles, another song cycle by Benjamin Britten in '61. Finally, in 1963, Britten's Nocturnal. Then, of course, he played Nocturnal for many years. '68, there was Bennett 5 Impromptus, Tom Eastwood Ballad Fantasy that I'm going to play right now, Peter Racing Fricker Paseo, another piece by Brindo, Richard Rodney Bennett Guitar Concerto in '70, '71 Malcolm Arnold Fantasy, Ralston Elegy, '73 Dodson Quintet for Guitar and Strings, '74 Humphrey Searle 5. That is a dodecaphonic composition, very, very interesting one. '74 again Lennox Berkeley Guitar Concerto, '76 Royal Winter Music by Hans Werner Henze, Suite by Giles Swain, '82 Michael Berkeley Sonata in One Movement, also again a lovely piece, about 12 minutes long. I don't see why people don't play that in exams, competitions, because it's a very strong piece. '83 Richard Rodney Bennett Sonata, Michael Tippett Blue Guitar in '84, another piece by Swain in '86. Then '86 again starts the collaboration with Leo Brouwer. The Concerto Elegiaco #3 comes up. '87 we have All in Twilight by Takemitsu. 1990 Leo Brouwer Sonata. I saw the premiere in January '91 at the Wigmore Hall. Then 1990, Peter Maxwell Davis Sonata. It was written for him, he didn't play. It was premiered by Tim Walker, but he had a hand in that piece. Then in '96, Toru Takemitsu, Into the Woods, one of the pieces dedicated to Julian. And of course, he sort of retired around 2002. But he was still, I remember his last concert at the Wigmore Hall, that was one of his last official concerts. Apart from the fact that in the first half, he played a very difficult Bach suite and everything, he played 2 premieres in the second half. We are talking about the last concert. I mean, why do you premiere the work in your last concert? But I had the chance of talking to him later on. I said, well, Julian, you shouldn't retire, you know, because even if you come on stage and play Pavanas by Luis Milan and Villa-Lobos Preludes, everybody will be delighted to hear you. And he replied to me, but that wouldn't be me. So it's very clear that he had a sense of mission that was very, very strong. So much so that after he retired, he donated much of his material to various colleges, both in London and in Manchester and Cardiff. Also, his collection of guitars was sold, and well, he created a fund that is managed by a bank. With the interest that he raises from that fund, he has the Julian Bream Trust that has 2 branches. One of them is to develop younger talent. So he provides scholarships for young players with whom he feels he's got some affinity and who he feels can carry his torch. There is at least one wonderful Italian guitarist who has been the recipient of that granddad is Giacomo Susani. And then, of course, the other branch of the Julian Bream Trust is to keep commissioning new music for the guitar. So he has managed to do something that many people judge impossible. That was getting a piece from Harrison Birtwistle, that is generally considered in Britain the greatest living British composer, who never got to write for Julian when he was still active. After that, Leo Brouwer, fifth guitar sonata, and then Laura Snowden premiered both Julian Anderson's Catalan Peasant with guitar and the sonata by Olli Mustonen, the wonderful Finnish pianist who is also a composer. And next week, Saki Kato, the Japanese guitarist, is premiering a new piece by Edward Cowie. So yeah, we have a new piece coming pretty much every year or every 2 years. And of course, we hope that will stay, in spite of the fact that Julian, unfortunately, is not in his best physical condition. So his, against his will, I heard, he's started to delegate a bit of his duties at the Julian Bream Trust. Giacomo would be able, or Laura would be able to tell you how it works. I mean, he says, oh, we are going to premiere this piece by Julian Anderson, so let's choose the program together. You have to play a Bach suite, and Antonio Jose Sonata, and the Berkeley Sonatine. So, I mean, he just is so controlling that he pretty much chooses the program, or he even does the graphic design of the program sometimes, because he learned that from his father. So, really a very controlling person, but for the good, because he really knows what he's doing. And in this area, in this era that we are, this era of curatorial skills, we have accessibility to pretty much anything we want with the click of a button, or even without a button sometimes. And choosing what to do is perhaps the greatest lesson that we can get from Julian Bream's repertoire and Julian Bream's wonderful career that really shaped the guitar for the second half of the 20th century. It's not a matter of what you know, but how to know what really matters. That is, in a sense, what he's taught us guitarists.
Thank you, Fabio. It was a great lecture. Maybe I can start, with one consideration. It's quite interesting to see how John Williams, Julian Bream, Andrea Segovia, they were changing the program almost every year. And not only with new pieces, with new commission, also with transcription, and in particular with Bream and Williams with chamber music. It is something that maybe is not, is more rare nowadays to see performers that are, so creative and so searching so much for new music.
Right. I think it has to do with the pattern of career they developed. I think both John and Julian, they were in the limelight with a very lively musical life right from the beginning. We have to remember that Julian, he played at the Wigmore Hall the first time when he was seen, and John was perhaps even earlier. So when you are developing that pattern of career at that level, that you are in the musical world out there, not just playing for your fellow guitarists, it works different. You cannot, just come back to the same hall every year and just repeat the easy success. It's important to bring out something, some new material. So, I mean, you engage your public. You really develop an audience year after year.
Yes, and this pressure of also making the guitar the same level of the other instruments, and something that is you feel more when you are in the musical environment, not only in the guitar.
You're right. You're right, and mind you, Julian was still in his early 20s when he played with Peter Pierce. At that time, Benjamin Britten, which was Peter Pierce's partner, he was the biggest name in musical life in Britain. And John Williams, I mean, he was friends with Daniel Barenboim, Jacqueline Dupre. I mean, the references were very, very strong. And it's fortunate that nowadays it seems that it's picking up again with people who are in their 20s, like Sean Chibe, and people who are, you know, again, working out there, not just playing for guitarists.
Okay, we have a question from Michael for consideration. I cannot see you, Michael.
You hear me?
Okay, yes, now yes.
Yeah. No, my camera doesn't seem to be working, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. Yeah, got it.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Fabio. Hi, how are you? That was brilliant. Thank you very much. And I've seen you play so many times, so it was a real thrill to hear you speak. It was lovely. So well about Julian Bream. I was just wondering, you spoke about the clear denial of Segovia's legacy and of the poet, the younger poet, kind of eschewing what the older poet had stood for and everything like that. And it's very, very fascinating. I did my studies on John Williams, so it's fascinating for me to hear that. Obviously, John Williams was very public about maybe his misgivings about Segovia and so on and so forth. I was just wondering, did Bream ever talk about this? Did he ever talk about moving in a different direction to Segovia, or the gap that Segovia's might have left, or any of those shortcomings that you spoke of?
That is a very interesting question, actually, because in a way, Bream, who was not noted as a Segovia disciple or something like that, he was perhaps more accepting and respectful of Segovia's influence on him than John has been in recent years, for sure. I remember that the first time I played for him, and we had, you know, a drink in the bar after the masterclass, he asked me I said, from Brazil. First thing he asked was, "Oh, do you know Olga Praga Coelho? How is she?" Well, Olga was Segovia's partner for 17 years. And they had met each other when Julian actually played for Segovia when he was, excuse me, when he was 14 or so. And Olga told me, in fact, what that meeting was like. And she said it was a disaster, actually, because Segovia didn't like Julian's playing at all. He was playing some Ponce music for him. He thought he was completely out of style, and he started to be very rude with him. And the other people who were in the room, they were not very helpful. So it was very traumatic for him. He said that he was 14, he started to cry, and he was very embarrassed because he wanted to play very big. And then Olga came and said, "Oh, I think we should have a coffee because everybody's a bit nervous today, blah, blah." And he was very grateful to her because she sort of saved the day for him. Yeah. But in spite of that, he was very respectful towards him. I remember asking him about Segovia's tone. He said, "Oh, it was the best guitar tone I've ever heard in my life." I said, "Well, Julian, there is another one that I think is very impressive." He said, "No." "Yes, you." And he said, "Well, did you see Segovia playing live?" I said, "No, unfortunately." He said, "Well, you don't have any idea of what you're talking about." So he was even a bit he was even modest to a fault in that case. He really accepts Segovia's influence and example for himself. But in fact, they were not very close to each other. There was a denial from Segovia towards him as well, in fact.
Yeah, I always think that's maybe why, with Williams being so much more involved with Segovia, and then he feels, I suppose, that he can criticize him more almost. I suppose he feels he was near enough to see.
That's right. But when you look at the playing itself, I think that John, he has developed a much more linear and much more rhythmic and urgent style. That is perhaps what we would call, the modern, the late 20th century guitar. Whereas Julian, in a way, he's a line of continuity starting from Segovia, at least to the way I look at things.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for watching.
Now we have a question from Carlos. Okay, now.
Hello, maestro.
Hello, Carlos. ¿Cómo estás?
Todo bien, maestro. You're a big pride for all Latin American guitarists. Thanks for bringing our continent so far. I want to make a kind of two-part question. The first would be, what do you know about the process of selection of the composers that Bream did for choosing who would be fit for writing for the guitar, and if you know if it was some kind of payment also for these works, where or who paid, if it was the case. That was the first part, and the second part would be, as you said, it wouldn't be Julian Bream if he wasn't so active on making so a lot of premieres. And do you know, maybe your opinion, did we already lose this kind of attitude of bringing new music and collaborating with composers? Because in my opinion, these works premiered by Bream and recorded by him the first time, we are not really able to play it very, very well after his great versions. We're not bringing them further, in my opinion, because he worked with the composer very closely, and we don't have this chance anymore. I don't know if can you maybe say about something about that?
Okay, I'll try to organize the reply. First, you asked about the sources for commissions. I think Julian has said in a couple of interviews how he got in touch with some composers. In fact, he would sort of follow those composers' career outside of the guitar world, of course. Watch premieres of symphonic piece music and try to choose the right moment, because sometimes you want to commission, imagine that you want to commission a piece by, say, George Benjamin. I mean, his mind might be in something else. He might be writing an opera or something. And it would be very difficult for him to reason and to focus his creativity into writing for a special instrument like the guitar. So first of all, you have to wait for the right moment for commissioning, because many of the composers, they don't write a lot for the guitar. Many of them write only one or two pieces and that's it. So I think that the first thing he tried to get really acquainted with a certain composer's work so he could commission at the right time. In terms of financial agreements, well, in Britain, there are many sources for that. Arts Foundation, Arts Council, private donors. And I know that he has used one of those at various times. I'm pretty sure that some of the composers just wrote for him out of friendship. But when he actually had to commission, he would take advantage of those official sources or private donors. And I know a couple of cases like Maxwell Davies. When Julian commissioned Hugh Runes, he made an agreement whereby Maxwell Davies would write the work for him, and then he would play a concert for free in a festival that was organized by the composer. So he was pretty much, paying from his own pocket, because he gave a concert for free. And this is something that I think we can do nowadays. In fact, I've been trying to do this year, to commission music from younger composers, and then you pay a fraction of your fee towards the composer's fee. You don't have to do it all at once. You can play the piece in 10 different concerts and pay 1/10 of your fee. So that is a way of doing, or even a kind of co-commission between different sources. I don't know if Julian has used that, but I'm pretty sure that he put from his own money when he found it worthwhile. when it comes to the work, I mean, the focus that he had on playing new and commissioned music, I think that we have to read the situation at the time. When you come back to the 50s and 60s, many people just look at the guitar just as a kind of Spanish Latin thing. And if you didn't play Asturias or Sevilla or something like that, people wouldn't be quite persuaded by the guitar. And as he was starting a career, and this career had to follow a different path from the one that was followed by Segovia and the previous generation. So again, he commissioned music that would lend to the guitar a language that it was not so associated with the ethnic aspect of the guitar repertoire. But still, when you look at some pieces like, say, Buckley's Sonatina, you still sense a bit of a Spanish flavor in the music. In fact, you hear the first movement, it sounds like a mock Spanish piece. You hear the second movement, it sounds a bit like blues. And the third movement sounds a bit like English folk music. So he's moving towards a language that is still fit for the guitar, but it's the substance denies a bit the Spanish and Latin heritage. So this is the first thing. He was creating a new repertoire to create a new guitar language, so to speak. Nowadays, I don't feel that so as a pressing problem. We have a lot of repertoire from the last 50 years that hasn't really entered student repertoire. I mean, how many people play even Bream's repertoire properly, as you said? We only play the point of the iceberg. We play 30% of what he commissioned. And the same with the music that was composed after him, like, the pieces written for Elliot Fisk or for Dave Starobin. Actually, the music got more complex. I mean, learning Berio Sequenza, for instance, is a hell of a lot of work. And that not many people take that as a matter of course. So unless we really incorporate those pieces in the repertoire, commissioning new music becomes a kind of cosmetic thing. Unless the person is really into that kind of thing, like, let's say, Dave Starobin or Sharon Nesbitt. I mean, people who really, it comes from the heart, so to speak. I don't believe that as a kind of career strategy, it really doesn't come from the heart. And you can tell that in the case of Julian and John Williams and the other ones I've mentioned, it's something that is very authentic, very genuine.
We have to still do our homework. We have a lot of work to do, no?
Well, sure, but I admit that if you are playing, let's say, for guitar societies and guitar clubs and guitar festivals, unless you're an extremely persuasive player, many people, they are there to hear Stanley Meyer's Cavatina or Asturias or something, or Piazzolla. That is the big thing nowadays. So, of course, you can only tell what is adequate for your style of playing, for your purpose in professional terms. So I don't give a recipe for everybody.
Thanks, Fabio. We have a question from Stefano.
Okay.
Stefano? Oh, sorry.
Hi. I'm here.
Ciao, Stefano.
Ciao. Video don't start, Marco.
Okay. Oh, now. We can see you.
Okay, here we are. Nice to meet you, Maestro. Thank you for sharing these informations and
my pleasure.
And tips about Julian Bream. I have a curiosity about the repertoire of Julian Bream because I'm trying to studying and discovering big productions and commissioned compositions. And about Apivor Variation, Opus 29, and Tristan Carey Sonata for Guitar Alone, these two pieces are not dedicated to the Julian Bream, but he commissioned these pieces, this composition. And my curiosity is why the author don't dedicate these pieces to him, and he ever played these pieces in his career?
I don't know, to be mind you. Walton's 5 bagatelles, they are not dedicated to Julian either. They are dedicated to Malcolm Arnold. So maybe the composer wanted to pay homage or to be kind to another person at that point. So he would just write, piece commissioned by Julian Bream and dedicated to so and so. That is my guess. From what I've heard, Ivor was not a very easy person. He had a very piercing personality. I don't know if they had some kind of disagreement. Probably not, because Julian actually premiered his guitar concerto. But I don't know if the variations. I haven't seen any programs with that. Maybe, many times, the composer deletes the dedication when they publish the music if the player doesn't play it.
Yeah.
I've come across this situation a couple of times. So maybe that might be a reason, but this is all guesswork. In the case of those specific pieces, I really don't know. I can ask other people who are more acquainted with that.
Just another one little question. Tristan Carey is an expert about electronic music. I try to remember. Ever Julian Bream tried to mix in classical instrument with electronics or something similar?
Not as far as I can tell. I haven't seen any. And at the time I had the chance to watch him live, for 10 years or so, he tended to be more, I wouldn't say conservative in his approach, but more circumspect. His concerts, they more and more looked like, the proper classical concert.
Okay.
Whenever he played something that was a bit unusual, he would, leave for the very end of the concert, like playing Piazzolla. That was pretty much as far as he went. I mean, of course, I wouldn't call that, as kind of experimental music, but it was a bit heterogeneous to his repertoire.
Okay.
I don't think that was his thing, was not his aesthetic.
Okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And Stefano, if you are interested, in 2 weeks we will have Steve Goss talking about collaboration, the process of collaboration of John Williams and Julian Bream with the composer. And now we have a question from Marcos.
Hi, Maestro. Thank you for this lecture.
Hello.
My name is Marcos. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting, your insights. My question was actually, I was listening to you. Why, I will put it in a bit provocative way, why don't we have an Angelo Gilardino for Julian Bream's repertoire? What do you think is the reason that for concerning Bream's repertoire, we don't have this tendency that we experienced in the classical guitar world, that we have to go to the original, we have to go back to the manuscript, we have to find the unedited versions before Segovia, let's say. Why do you think that we don't have the same effect or the same trend, let's say, in Bream's repertoire? Or it has to do with the way of collaboration, or because Julian Bream maybe was more respectful, let's say, on the original, or it was the collaboration was closer? I think it's a very interesting issue. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Of course, this is a bit of a guesswork, but I would say that this trend hasn't reached Julian's repertoire yet. I think it's starting to pick up, and many people are starting to come back to manuscripts and the original version. Mind you, when Segovia was alive, nobody would question his edition, because it was pretty much that kind of respectful thing. He's the guy who worked with Manuel Ponce or Tanzman or Castelnuovo Tedesco. That is the final version, and that's it. In a sense, that's it, because the composers were alive at the time, and they agreed to have the music published with Segovia's revision. If they didn't want it, they could have refused, of course, but they didn't. And I think with Julian was pretty much the same thing. As you can see in some internet videos, I mean, there was a lot of give and take between him and the composers. He would invite them to his home, and they would spend, many hours together working in the details. So that was pretty much of an agreement. But the trend of coming back to original sources will never go, of course. We want to see what I don't know, Hans Werner Henze's first manuscript was like. We want to better understand the music and the process of creation for these composers. And also the process of revision for Julian Bream. Many people don't realize that in many cases, he interfered much more than it was usual for Segovia, for instance. I have one very big example, that is Cyril Scott's Sonatina, that was published by Gilardino. When it was discovered, he sent a copy to Julian, and well, first of all, Julian thought that there was a page missing. He said, "Oh no, the last movement is a bit weird, it's too short and blah, blah, blah." And he just assumed that there was something missing in between. And Gilardino made very clear that there was no sign, no clue of having a missing page in Cyril Scott's Sonatina. But Julian, he just went on and composed a whole section for the piece for his premiere. So, that is big interference, and that is with a composer that has been long dead. So, Julian, he is a bit of a composer. When he went to the Royal College, it is a subject that he had a lot of interest for. He composed, for instance, the end of Alan Rawsthorne's Elegy. I don't think it is a competent work, but perhaps not the best that one could get. But he knows enough to feel really entitled and to feel secure to interfere with the composition. So I think, answering to your question, I think people haven't started yet, but you see people like Stuart French, who is a British guitarist. He's recorded, I think, Walton's 5 Bagatelles with a version based on the manuscript. So I think it's only a matter of time before people start to work on the other pieces as well.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
The only maybe difference is that, for example, with some composer that worked with Julian Bream, we have statement from the composer that they, for example, Henze say that the final version is the published one. So there is the manuscript, but it's a little bit stronger than what we have, for example, with Segovia. That sometimes we can,
Maybe, that's right. In my experience with composers, of course, many of them are very controlling, and many of them are less controlling, and they just want an overall picture. But what I see that is common to everybody, they don't want different versions of the same music running around. When the piece is finally reached an edition, they want everybody who learned it to learn from the same source. Otherwise, it creates a lot of confusion.
That's a very nice consideration. Okay, I think that if there are no any other questions, we finish for today. So we will continue next week with the repertoire of Julian Bream, John Williams, with Michael O'Toole. And then we will have Dr. Steve Goss talking about the collaboration, the process of collaboration.
Wonderful.
So I hope to see you all also next week in the rest of the series.
I'll try to attend to you. I'm really curious about that.
Great. We'll be honored to have you. Okay, so
thank you to you all. It was great talking to you.
Fabio, we stay a little bit more with my student just for...
Okay, no problem. Well, thank you all for all the kind messages.
Obrigado, maestro. Ciao,
My
ciao.
pleasure. Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao, Marco.
Ciao, ciao Carlos. Ciao Luis, ciao a tutti.